Hey, I'm Anthony. We're back. It's May 3rd. I'm with my co-hosts Francesca and Shane, and this is the Future Proof podcast from CoAI. And we're excited to talk about more LLMs, more AI, but more specifically, I think we're going to dig into like what GitHub is doing with their products and the stuff they're announcing. I'm going to kick it over to Francesca to see. I think you had some starter questions for us, so let's just jump in and start talking.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. We're very excited to be back talking about the new frontier of AI. And this time, we're really focusing on AI that can code, which seems like a very wild idea if you think about it from the very meta level that people are coding these AI models and teaching them how to code. And GitHub is really juicy on this topic. And I wanted to throw it back to you, Anthony, to just, start us off by telling us, what is GitHub and what are they doing in the space of AI models that can now seemingly code for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it might be a good idea just to kind of, for folks that are not even close to GitHub as a user, they've never even heard the two words put together. I think I'll just kind of back us up there for a moment. So, Git is a version control piece of software. So that means like as you're working with your software, if you're a software developer, you're writing code, it's a database in which you can kind of save your changes and test your code. And then if you made a mistake, you can kind of roll back. And especially becomes important when you're working with a team of people, maybe across time zones, to coordinate all that coding effort. Git came onto the market when, I'd say 20 plus years ago by a programmer named Linus Torvalds, who also created the operating system called Linux. Everyone back 20 years ago were using a totally different kind of version control system. And it was kind of awkward to use when you were all around the world. And so the genius of Git was that it kind of helped you create your code would all reside on your laptop or your computer. And then when you were done, you would say, hey, Francesca, here's all my code. See if you can run it. And if you make an update, you can kind of give it back to me. So it was really a kind of a peer-to-peer version of version control. And that became really powerful. However, it was hard to host on your own systems. So what happened was GitHub emerged and they simply just said, hey, we could host it in the cloud for you. Again, Git was a peer-to-peer. It still is a peer-to-peer source control repository. And so GitHub emerged and they were like, hey, everyone can just store it in the cloud. And so Francesca, Shane, and I, we could all just be looking at the same code base, what they call download, you'd actually clone the code base for the newbie, and you would do your changes and you'd merge it back to the master, which is the master code base, and everyone can kind of get that version. That was very powerful. That's been active for the last 20 years, and it's been pretty much where all the open source coding exists, sort of like on planet Earth. Not exclusively, but a lion's share of it.
Yeah.
Now, fast forward, after Microsoft bought GitHub and they've introduced their LLMs, they've introduced a product called Copilot, which would actually allow you to type some code in, or you could type in a command and it could help you think through the next sort of level of code for you to write. So it could kind of like an LLM, you write in a prompt, like write me a story about a dog. The LLM will write you a story about a dog. What Copilot does is it says, I want to write this function, like a for loop or some sort of software function, and it would actually write it for you. And then you would simply edit it to make it accurate for you. That's the Copilot addition to GitHub. And that is very helpful for developers. In most cases, if you're using a tool to write your code, let's say VS Code, it was often very easily to do tab completions. Since the code is very structured, it could kind of guess that you're going to write this. So that's kind of like, hopefully answering your question, Francesca. Might have gone too far back in time,
No,
but
no, this was great. And I actually wanted to jump in with sort of a personal example. So I was introduced to GitHub like 10 years ago. And that was also my first introduction to Git. And it was introduced to me in the context of doing peer programming at university, sort of if you and your classmates had to do a group project for your computer science class, you were pretty much like 10 times out of 10 going to put your project on GitHub. And that was like very powerful in even something as simple as your class group project or your class assignment, where it really was that you could collaborate using this kind of platform, GitHub, with your fellow programmers, with your classmates, do it yourself on your own device, and then, kind of re-upload it, push it up there to where the main code lived, and everyone could really work together on it. So I think it's really interesting in the context of now having this added tool that not only, GitHub already made it very easy for programmers to work together and collaborate on a project. And now
yeah.
you have this added tool to actually create the code itself. And I guess for the audience members, Anthony or Shane, like, what does having that extra tool, what do you think having that extra tool means for sort of the developer skill set now, or the programming skill set? Like, I learned about GitHub from school, and now maybe, if this were 10 years later, I could have been a student with my peers on GitHub doing my computer science homework, and now this Copilot thing can actually suggest some answers to the assignment as well.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, and maybe Shane, you should chime in. I mean, Copilot is offering, it's in some case, if you're a really, really good programmer, and you're lazy at certain areas, it's going to solve some problems for you. But if you're really new to coding, you might have recalled early on, Francesca, you might download some boilerplate code, like some example code, and then you kind of hack the example code. Like you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to move some stuff around. That was often a way that you learned. But now with Copilot, you could almost merely type in what you want it to do. I want you to analyze this set of numbers. And then when you get the set of numbers giving me back to an array, and I want to print them to screen, like you could kind of tell it the program, what the program you want it to be. And it could suddenly write that code for you. And it might be wrong. It might be almost right. And then it will allow you to kind of hack on that code. And it's powerful. I mean, it's just that in itself is a magic power. And I think that like I heard, what I would just like to say is it's probably the worst it's ever going to be right now. Like, do you know what I mean? It's only going to get significantly better. So for like a student or for someone who's brand new, who's never coded because it's been very intimidating, it's probably the first time ever that you could erase that idea from your mind and say, if you could speak a language, a natural language, you could just simply describe the program you want written and see if it could write. And the common program that people are seemingly trying to ask Copilot to write is a Pong game. It's like, can you make this game Pong? And, if you miss the ball, person loses. If and if you could describe that, Copilot can build you that software. That's powerful. Shane, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's representative of the broader trend in AI, which is really about how do you condense your existing workflow and how do you make it just a lot more efficient. And I'm not surprised that, GitHub is releasing features like this, because if anyone were to create an AI solution for coding, you'd think GitHub would be at or near the top of that list. They've got something like 2 million paying subscribers, or just under that, or paying users of GitHub, 50,000 different enterprises that are paying to use GitHub, which means there's just an enormous amount of code in those repositories. And that is what you need to train these models. So the fact that they are, thinking about addressing these problems in code generation should not at all be surprising. And we all probably know developers in the community that are very reluctant to use a lot of AI tools, whether because they're purists or for philosophical reasons, or they don't trust, the results they're getting back. But an increasing number of developers are definitely relying more and more on these tools. I think the stat that we've got here is something like, they say 44% of developers already say they use some form of, AI tool for coding tasks, and another, 25 or 26% plan to do so in the future. So, like you're saying, Anthony, it's really just the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that after being an ex-programmer for a long time, you definitely get lazy on doing things. So like solving the problem, like actually like trying to refactor something to make it like, a tenth of a second faster, that's kind of a cool problem to solve. But like writing unit tests or that kind of stuff sometimes becomes arduous. So I think what's really kind of cool about a product like Copilot is you can ask it to like write you could test your code. And so it's really good at like it's really quite good at like reading the code because it knows how to read, and then it could simply write a test like, does this function pass or fail, or does it, and that is really powerful for QA teams and other groups in your organization. But if you're listening to this and you're like, I've always been intimidated by this, I really think this opens the door for really like novice developers. Do you mean like, meaning that you might be like a product manager or you're a product owner and you're used to like writing out really detailed specifications about how the software should work? It turns out that those detailed specifications could actually possibly just turn into the code automatically. And then your developers who are more that are actually more skilled could be like, okay, half of this is bad and half of it's good, but you might actually be able to stand up a prototype really quickly. And for like people that are sort of not designated as a programmer, this whole push allows what I would say everyone to become a programmer in a way. And where GitHub was originally, and I think this was your original question, Francesca, was like, what is Git and where did it come from? It's like Git was really much about a tool to allow programmers to coordinate each other's work, and they can see it, and they can see it you see it on a web page, and then you could download it and then make a change and push it back up, and your colleague could see it. Like, that stuff might be going to the background, and it could be like, hey, I can see this code Francesca wrote, I'm going to download it, and my Copilot, the way I'm thinking about it, could actually edit all that code and push it back up. But I might not have to push those buttons to do that. It might just actually know that I need to push this up, and and it could actually do the merge. Like, right, that's the hardest part of some of this stuff is like, I just wrote 10 lines of code, Francesca just wrote 20 lines of code, 5 of them are in conflict. You could have Copilot help start understanding how to merge those lines of code together. That's a very hard task. It's a hard task for programmers. It's a hard task for new people. So I think all of this Git components might actually be falling falling backwards, and some of this more complex stuff is going to be solved with Copilot, which is going to allow more developers that are novices to join the ranks of writing software.
Yeah.
I'd be interested just to hear what your guys' thoughts are on this. Sorry to interrupt you, Francesca, but what you're saying seems to suggest to me that a lot of the early product development with Copilot was really, more in the pain relieving category, right? So for example, like, you say this all the time, Anthony, but a lot of the dirty secret about programming is that you spend most of your time trying to figure out why everything is not working, right? So, and that is also true when you're collaborating. It's especially true when you're collaborating across a very big group, or maybe you've inherited someone else's code, and now you've got to spend an enormous amount of time just going through and checking the logic, seeing how, what is it that's making this program work. That is a very time-consuming task. people write in different styles, they use different conventions. And the early versions of, Copilot that, I saw were really more geared at those types of use cases where it's like, hey, explain this code to me.
Yeah.
Point out a bug, right? But, one of the main things we want to talk about today is the new release to Copilot, which is this workspace product, which seems to be now just an entirely different category, less about pain relief, more about like, how do you even get started, right? How do you turn an idea into an actual product? But I know you had something you wanted to say, Francesca, and I cut you off, so go for it.
Well, I actually, Shane, if you sort of go into kind of explaining for the audience what GitHub Copilot Workspace is, that might kind of lead me into the question.
Anthony's probably a lot better geared at answering that question than I am.
I think my question will require that context anyway.
Yeah. So that's great. I mean, so so we kind of we got Git is the base here. It's a hub. People are looking at each other's code. Everyone can kind of work together. Now you have Copilot that's just reading that code, and it's kind of like helping you write code or write unit tests, etc. It's great. I think that what I'm reading from the CEO of Copilot is saying is they're kind of with workspace is it's actually kind of going to the next level where it's allowing allowing you to plan your whole product, right? So kind of a little backstory. GitHub was all about just managing Git repos, which is a very transactional sort of state. And for some listeners that might just sound kind of boring, but it was coordination and keeping your code in a database.
Anthony, if I could jump in there to just illustrate for the audience how tedious it was to manage a GitHub repository. Like there is a very specific workflow that you have to follow with very specific instructions. And so when you hear Anthony or when you hear me say words like push or like merge or pull request, like those are all, those are like everyday English words, but also very specific Git words. And it was so tedious to the point that when I first learned how to use GitHub, I had one doc that was literally just the workflow to even get me to the right place to actually do the code for the project. And so there's this step before the code, the pre-coding step, to actually even set you up on GitHub to the right place to then do the harder cognitive task of doing the coding project itself.
That's right. It's like you have this for someone who has an idea, like let's say you're brand new and you want to write a video game called Pong. You're like, I want to write this game Pong. You've written it all down, like you've got it all planned. And then you're faced with trying to figure out how to just operate the repository. It's like, it's just and frankly, for a lot of people, it may have turned you off from programming in a way so I think that GitHub Workspace is sort of addressing that issue, right? They're looking at the next evolution of where millions and millions of people have ideas that have to be expressed in code, and they're going to try to eliminate the tediousness at all. And
I would also just interject by saying one of the reasons why, repositories like GitHub are so crucial to the developer ecosystem is that people share their work, right? And they share their work for many reasons. One is because they want to allow other developers to be able to leverage that work. I mean, it's also kind of a resume in itself. So knowing how to navigate something like a GitHub is actually pretty important, not just for being able to display your work, but your entire career in a lot of cases, especially in the open source community.
Yeah, for sure. And there's millions of private repositories, meaning just the three of us could see, and then there's millions of public repositories, which we often call open source. But the point is that I would say the last 20 years of software development, that has taken place on GitHub, is is, you had to actually the requirement is like you have to learn how to use Git really well. And along when Microsoft bought the product, they started offering more features like how do you track an issue? Like, hey, there's a bug in the software, and you'd log an issue, and then someone would say, okay, I'll fix why I hit print, the whole program crashes. You'd put an issue in there, and people would attach the issue to the bug in the software. And so you'd start having like human English describing the problem connected to actually the code. That was really an important point, because you can link that, because let's say a year later, you're the next engineer working on it, and you're like, why did this happen? And then you could read the issue, you could read the code, and you could start. And this is very important in the world of software development, is like learning the history of why things were done. I think where Git workspace is taking to the next level is that it's contemplating that you might actually need to start somewhere, and you start by writing out your aspirations of the product that you're trying to build or project. And as you're doing that, it's logging that as into the repo, but it also is allowing the Copilot to actually build out that first version of your software. And workspace, and you can share that with a friend. So it's taking the idea that the product owner or product manager or the creator of the software may not be the actual person that's writing the code. It's like, it's just work. They're not even calling it code, right? You're planning your product.
The key thing here is that you can just explain in natural language what you're trying to do and have that translated to the actual code, which means that there needs to be some level of knowledge to even get into this tool to begin with. Which I think is probably still very intimidating for a lot of people who are just not developers. But assume you're in already, being able to explain, again, in natural language, the goal of the product and have the code essentially magically appear is very powerful.
Yeah,
and I
so
think that is really the story for me here, which is GitHub's, actively building towards expanding their user base well beyond people who are, classically trained in software engineering.
Yeah, so we are, I think we're in an inflection point if you look at GitHub and you're like, okay, this is where a lot of code and a lot of people are working. They said, it's really clear that the name of the company is called Git, and they added Hub. Git is an open source control repository. They were founded on that. And this new CEO is saying, we're now refounded on Copilot. What is Copilot? Copilot is an LLM. Which LLM? It's OpenAI's LLM. So like, we now have this company that's 20 plus years old is rebranding itself as founded on Copilot, which means that their new look is at the non-developer community, which is the largest market on the planet Earth.
Yeah, and I'm glad that is where you led us, Anthony, because that's exactly where I want to jump in and kind of give the broader context of Copilot.
Right.
So we've talked about sort of Copilot's capabilities, and that this Copilot workspace, this next evolution of Copilot, where it's actually allowing you to define your project. It isn't just about the coding completions or understanding the code, but it is this all-encompassing workspace as part of GitHub Copilot. In their launch, to your point, Anthony, and your point, Shane, GitHub last year celebrated over 100 million developers. They say now, with this evolution of Copilot Workspace, they want to accelerate us to a future where 1 billion people, so going from 100 million developers to 1 billion people on GitHub, can very easily use this platform to create their projects.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an incredibly lofty goal. And really, the acceleration comes from this Gen AI. But I want to focus really on this point of what is the Gen AI behind this, because I think that's also a really interesting discussion. So as Anthony mentioned earlier, Microsoft acquired GitHub. Microsoft famously is tied to OpenAI, along with recently Mistral, but that basically leads us to this very interesting sort of triangle of key players in the developer community and now in the broader community of Microsoft leveraging this OpenAI LLM and folding it into this very, very, very powerful developer platform called GitHub, and rebranding this package as GitHub Copilot Workspace. And, it's free to sign up for GitHub. You can pay for a sort of, higher level of GitHub, but the barrier to entry was basically an email address to get started on GitHub. Copilot, however, is a paid subscription in the very basic level. And so I think that has a lot of implications, just in terms of the AI race and sort of tech players that we discuss at length every week. Do either of you have any initial comments about sort of what this means just for the evolution of big players in the tech space? We already see this triangle of massive players in the mix here.
Well, to me, it means that Microsoft is the unequivocal leader in the space. And I know a lot of people think of OpenAI as really the hub of innovation, and not to take away any credit from them, because I think they've built just this incredible reputation for shipping what are really groundbreaking products. But you mentioned some of the other players, like Mistral. Microsoft has its hands in, I think, all the most important younger companies. And I don't know if we never talked about this, but there was the memo from Satya Nadella that came out a couple weeks back where they were talking about OpenAI. And I'm reading directly from this memo now. He says, "It would not matter if OpenAI disappeared tomorrow. We have all the IP rights, all the capability. We have the people, we have the compute, we have the data, we have everything." He says, "We are below them, above them, around them." Right. So that's a lot of gusto. That's a lot of confidence to be speaking. I don't think that OpenAI is just going to disappear. They're powering GitHub, Copilot, as we said. But, you think about the fact that Microsoft owns GitHub, you think about their involvement with a number of the major startups in the space, and their ability to integrate a lot of these products across a variety of different, tools, whether it's PowerPoint or Microsoft Office or, many others. So, it's a power play for sure, but I think out of all the big existing, incumbents, they are probably, in my opinion, the most well-positioned to, drive this wave.
Yeah, I would say, like for all of us that were like really, fans of GitHub and users, in the, when it first started 20 years ago, which I was a member of, we were kind of bummed that Microsoft bought them, right? There was kind of like what? Like Microsoft's buying GitHub? That was kind of a shock. So I think the story here, like for both the sort of like, AI curious and the AI insider, it's like Satya is basically saying like, we don't care what LLM we are using. We own all the data. Like we have all the data. Like we literally, and I think to put it in context, like the amount of code contained in GitHub is the largest code repository ever created on planet Earth in the history of existence. It's like literally the repository for everything. And that is really powerful because you can train on that. Now there's a whole bunch of can of worms in there that we're not going to address, which I think a lot of programmers and creators could take exception to. The fact of the matter is that has given Microsoft this ability to take what might be 200 million developers worldwide and say, we're going to grow that to 1 billion people using our software. So, I mean, I think that's where you were going, Francesco, was like Microsoft, most people might not even know most people that are not familiar with GitHub won't realize that Microsoft owns GitHub, right? Microsoft owns LinkedIn, it owns GitHub, and it owns itself, right? So it's integrated into the developer community really substantially. But right now, they're going to grow I think Workspace, if they play their cards the way that Microsoft plays, they're going to have 1 billion developers because all you will need to do is be able to describe what you want. And presto, at the other end, will be a piece of software that they can run. And for the people that are new here as well, Microsoft owns something called Azure, which just means your code could run in the cloud. Like you won't even know it happened. It just happens for you. And what happens is you just get a bill every month. But I mean, I think what Francesca was also pointing out, you could get a hit. You used to be able to get you can get like a free account on GitHub still, but right now it's like $4 a month. But, and if you do a private repository, that's another thing. But I feel like where the real big win is for Microsoft is they get another billion people that are writing kind of various levels of software that is all hosted in their cloud. And that is a singular occurrence on planet Earth right now. There is no other company that's doing that. They're not even close.
Yeah. And I want to dive a little bit just deeper into the, I guess, logistics, if I can call it that, of getting started with Copilot for, the audience members who maybe, you're being introduced to GitHub for the first time. So as Anthony said, you can sign up with your, with your email on a GitHub account right now. There are two plans, but it's worth noting that Copilot is an additional subscription on top of, your GitHub account, which I think is also just interesting in terms of the fact that, GitHub was very much this more open environment. And, if it's a public repository, you can basically look into that code base for free and you can kind of repurpose that code for free pending what the licensing agreement is.
You could certainly learn
there's
it.
already this.
You could certainly learn it for free, right? You can read it, and that's how you learn. Yeah.
And so it's interesting that, there is no free Copilot. So we do want to make that clear, similar to how there is a premium to pay for, Chat GPT-4. What's interesting to me, and maybe this is another, really fascinating, broader question, comes down to really this question that has been at the top of mind since ChatGPT became pop culture, which was about ownership or about sort of intellectual property. And it gets juicy when it comes down to code because different plans on Copilot at different price points have some IP indemnity agreement.
Yeah.
And the fact that that is readily advertised on the GitHub Copilot pricing page indicates that this is something that they are also internally discussing. And it really comes down to the question of if you are a developer and you are using Copilot, say you are, a solo entrepreneur, you are building your business, you can finally code in a way that you had not been able to code before, etc. Then it comes down to who really owns this? Who owns this? Because we have so many power players in the mix now. Copilot, under GitHub, Microsoft, OpenAI, can they claim some ownership on it? You are also maybe a solo entrepreneur dipping your toe in the pool of, developers. Where do we see this going? Because is it really going to be a case as, Microsoft leads the race in creating these tools that they are just going to get so powerful with the sort of ownership right to the great things people might come up with?
I think the fact that it is on the pricing page is an implicit admission that they do lay claim to a lot of code, which quite frankly is not theirs, right? And one of the big complaints in the open source community is how products like Copilot were even created in the first place, right? To make a product like this, you need to train on data. And what Microsoft or what GitHub did was take all of the data in their repositories and train the models. And the problem with that is if you are, there have been instances where, people have used Copilot and it literally just spit back, verbatim or close to verbatim code that was somebody else's, right? And without making any sort of, proper attribution to the code. Now, if you're an open source developer, that is really not a good thing for you, because again, GitHub is a place where you go to share your work, you build a body of work, you get other work in the future, you build a reputation for yourself. And, if you are no longer getting attribution for your code, that's a big problem for you.
Yeah. I mean,
and I think it's a good step. It's a step in the right direction for GitHub to say, look, we will cover, if you produce code and it's discovered that it's infringed on somebody else's IP, we'll cover the legal costs. That's a step in the right direction, but I don't think it's going the full distance.
I mean, it's a really sticky
Yeah.
thing. I mean, I would say my spicy take is it's I don't think what they did was probably really right, but let's save that for another podcast. But I would say
it's also the same problem across the rest of the industry,
yeah.
right? ChatGPT, the same thing.
Yeah,
it's
and
not books, it's code.
Yeah. And that's why I asked, because if I'm really thinking of it from the perspective of someone who is trying this for the first time and now empowered by Copilot, say I did have this idea for a great app and only now can I empower myself to create this app and maybe monetize the app on the App Store or on Google Play. Like, what does that mean for me?
Yeah.
I mean,
so is the question you're getting at, like, should you feel safe using a product like that if your data is not actually yours?
I mean, safe could be one, vein of it. It could be many other things.
I think it's safe. I mean, I don't see Copilot or Microsoft saying you've just written this great app using Workspace, which is kind of another realm. By the way, I think we could clarify, but I don't think Workspace is giving that same indemnification. But
okay,
I think because it's a new total bite of the apple.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems like I haven't got my
It does not, at least according to the source here, it does not.
Yeah. So I think Workspace is offering a different thing. You might not even be able to, you might not write any code. You just might write your plan for your code, right? And then from there. But I think that,
which is even an even more interesting question to some extent.
Yeah. So I think Francesco, you're asking it's kind of like I think you said juicy. I also would say maybe it's spicy because it's like, do you feel even though they're giving you this ability to do something you weren't able to do, are you also foregoing like your ideas to them? And I think maybe that's what you're getting to. And I would say, as a part of super convenience, which is there is a cost to super convenience. They are definitely saying, if you do this, you get this, but we also get that. Now, I don't think they're going to go compete with you on the open market with your idea, but it may be that your ideas are getting crystallized in some version of the LLM that will persist for decades because you can't really take it. You can't extract it out, right? So, I think those are spicy takes. I maybe at the top of the funnel though, I think that for just like regular people that are like that they've always wanted to do this, this is awesome. This is awesome for them. Yeah. For me as a jaded old programmer, I'm kind of like, I have a lot of takes on this that are not necessarily this is awesome. But I think just thinking about someone who's 10 years old right now and how much firepower they have to create something, it's just amazing. And I think so I can kind of hold two thoughts in my mind here at the same time on that.
And I want to sort of disclaim for the audience that this idea, this maybe point of conflict or this tension between like the creator, so yourself, and maybe the tools that you're using or leveraging is not a new thing. When I was formulating this question in my head, I was thinking of it in terms of people who are influencers or content creators on YouTube. Like YouTube, for every video, especially if you are a massive influencer, like YouTube is getting a significant cut of the ad revenue generated on your videos. And 70. YouTube has that as like proprietary content, and that has not stopped this boom of content creators in the last couple of decades from posting on YouTube, and it has made YouTube still the probably most powerful video sharing platform for the kind of content creation. So I can
And
see it from the
by the way,
yeah.
this same issue exists with YouTube and, like
Yep.
OpenAI, for example, and they notoriously ran out of data to train their models on, turned directly to YouTube, right?
Yeah.
That's why we have Whisper, right? Which is essentially just a software that allowed them to transcribe video into text, which they could then feed into training their models. And so you could ask the same question: does it make sense to be a YouTube creator if you know that your content is being fed into these models? And I would very much argue yes, because to Anthony's point, there is this cost to super convenience. And we've talked about this before in previous podcasts. There are so many quote unquote business people out there who have great ideas and they don't know how to put it into action. So now they're faced with the problem of finding someone who does know how to build what's in their mind, right? And so we're talking about products specifically like Copilot that are further removing that barrier to you if you've got a good idea, but now you're struggling to get to a point where you can actually make it tangible.
Yeah. And so on the topic of sort of creating that easier barrier to entry, maybe we should also talk about the competitors to Copilot. I would say that the other, Copilot is definitely not the only Gen AI tool out there that has and advertises some kind of coding and developing capabilities. Maybe we want to talk about, some of the things that other big players in the tech space are doing and how that, kind of leads to this bigger question of, where, like, what frontier is Gen AI approaching next? Right now we're in the coding frontier. Copilot is not the only tool out there. Maybe we can start talking about some of the other things in existence and what that means for this whole ecosystem of Gen AI.
Absolutely. Before we go there, I just want to say your YouTube example is like so spot on, because broadcasting a show took a gigantic team and lots of hardware to do that, right? And then it was reduced to YouTube in the cloud. And it lots of people made their transition there, and now big companies are now publishing on YouTube. You can kind of see the parallels. Like making code was really hard, lots of people. Now it might be actually given to everyone and everyone can do it. And I think that going to your exact next question is like the race there is fierce, right? There's like, I think you mentioned Codium, but there's also like Cody, which is also based on another product. There's Devin. I mean, Shane and I have, I think, like 25 other applications that are doing code gen, and they're all doing kind of various levels. They might actually all be using ChatGPT at some levels, but it's what's really quite interesting. They have different takes on it. You know what I mean?
Well, one of the big themes here for me is really in the user experience, right? Because GitHub is not easy to use, right? And it's especially not going to be easy for someone who's listening to this thinking, great, I can just jump in and use natural language to program some cool idea I have. But there's just a lot. It's easier said than done, right? So, for me, it really does come down to what is the super convenience when it comes to how you use this, right? Because if you can't even figure out how to get into the editor, right, like none of it really matters.
Yeah, I think that's where other folks are coming in and kind of creating their own versions of this. So, I mean, I think,
well, by the way, the reason I brought that up is because you said they may all be using the same underlying model, right? So, like, to me, it begs the question of where's the differentiation? Is it the model
it's going to be UX,
or is it really just how the people use the model? And I think it's very much the latter.
Yeah, the UX here will really matter because, and I haven't used Workspace, so I don't know what their UX experience is. I think that if I'm a younger if I'm not even a developer, I'm just a person with an idea, and I don't even want to know how to spell Git. I just want to be like, hey, can you make me this thing? I want to like post photos of my house online on my own website.
Yeah.
Presto, it just does it for you. Like, I mean, that's the future. And you wouldn't call like your sister a developer if she built you this cool app to take photos. You know what I mean? You just call her your sister and she made this cool thing for you. I actually think that all these folks that are making these things, Francesca, your question, whether it's Amazon or brand new companies like Devin, I think they're all pointing their opportunity at like turning billions of people into creators of software. I mean, I think that's it. It's like, I'm not even using the word developer. I'm not even using the word Git. I think there's an opportunity in the space right now to make anyone that can think of something that could be made with software. They just think it, they say it, it's built, it's deployed, you've got it.
Well,
And
you
that's like,
mentioned Amazon. I mean, that's the perfect, most recent example to me. I mean, their own product, Code Whisperer, it's really their version of Copilot. They're very much a laggard to Copilot in terms of users and active developers, but they have the same exact mission. They just rebranded Copilot to Q now because they don't want to appeal to just the developers, right? Same thing with
which is like
OpenAI,
a
by the way,
conspiracy theory word, by the way, Q. This is
yeah,
like the worst
it's
name.
more accessible.
Yeah.
But they rebranded to Q, and the whole reason, from my understanding, is that they want to reach a much broader audience. And if you go look at their documentation, they've got, very much a Q for developer product, but they've also got this Q for business product, which is not geared towards the programmers. It's all about doing things like taking your enterprise's, all of the data in your enterprise, being able to provide things like natural language questioning to that data, and even being able to do things like prototyping simply by using natural language. So now everyone on your team can leverage your knowledge base at your company and start to create, or at least prototype, new products.
Yeah.
And completely eliminating the barrier to entry, like we're talking about, of creation.
I'm really glad you mentioned that, Shane, because in listening to both yours and Anthony's comments, we've been talking a lot about Copilot as the stepping stone towards building out a completed kind of software-based product, basically condensing the startup team into a single person. But I imagine that for many of the listeners of this episode, and also just many of the users who have no prior coding experience, maybe no background in computer science, maybe not even working in the tech industry, right? There is a very clear subset of tasks that can be easily accelerated with even just very basic knowledge of a slice of programming. And I think of data analysis as a key one. So I'm really glad you brought it up, because if you are, maybe you're a social scientist, maybe you're a consultant for, some environmental fund, and you really just have all this data, raw data, and you don't really want to be hiring, a data analytics person to help you with this, but you need some compelling visualizations for just 3 slides that you're presenting next week. This is, I think, the superpower of these coding agents today. Like, I am a little bit skeptical, and I have my own, hesitation, similar to Anthony, that could be a different podcast, maybe next week's podcast, about, proprietary, like, software products. Like, if you're really creating your startup with Copilot and that's the only kind of coding talent that you have, quote unquote talent, that's a completely different question from, I just have this raw data, I need 3 charts for my slides next week. This is where I think the opportunity really is. And with Q Enterprise, it seems like they've, attuned their product to knowing that this is gonna be maybe the most rapidly adopted use case. People who are just needing the coding agent to do one step or one task in their job, just not, reinventing their entire professional career. Yeah.
I would even go just one step further than that. Like you mentioned, like, is the big business going to be the one that's built by some person who has no experience building in Copilot? Probably not. But like, that process to go from 0 to 1 when you're first starting something doesn't require that, right? So like, if you are that, business person who's got just that glimpse of a really cool idea, you don't have a team, this is a really powerful tool, or at least is the making, I think, of a really powerful tool where you can start to describe that idea that you've got and make it tangible so that you take it to that next person who is going to be the one who actually builds the tech. Sometimes that's really what it takes to convince people, to join your cause, to come on board, to write a check, right?
Yeah.
And oh yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
No, I was going to say that on both your guys' point about like enterprise data and competitors, for people that are working at a company, everyone knows that like Francesco was saying, like, I need graphics for these 3 slides, or I'm in a group in customer success, and I have all this data. I need someone to help me analyze it. I think that like all this new stuff that we're talking about will actually allow you to do that. And you might not think you're building software, but you're just simply asking like, hey, take something that would normally take actually software or IT to kind of write code to kind of sort through it and do that for you. And so I think that's where the workspaces of the world. I also think like Snowflake that launched their product called Arctic, which is like hyper tuned to like the Snowflake's SQL, etc. That's like writing complex queries. So there will be competitors like that will challenge, because it's like a different version of Copilot. You don't really need it. You don't need workspace. You don't need any of that. If you're asking your enterprise for corporate data, they'll probably have an Arctic installation. But what's interesting, what might be interesting for people to realize, is that there's literally hundreds of billions of dollars of companies that make dashboards and front ends for corporate America that are all going to get changed. Because you're going to be able to talk to data, which is not true right now. And if you need an answer, you don't really want to go hunt through and menu dive through dashboards that you can't find or you don't have a login to. You just want to go to your phone and know that I'm talking to my corporate data set. I need to know how many sales are in this place. The field rep needs to know this, that, and the other. And that's something that is really powerful. And those programs are going to be probably written by business users that have a problem in the field, and they could just describe the problem in the field, and the software will automatically happen, and they'll get their data. And I think that will get really good really soon, and that will be very powerful.
Yeah, and I guess my final point on this, same thread is that earlier you asked, with all these different coding AI assistants coming out, what is the differentiator then going to be among them other than performance? Like, let's say we are almost certainly going to get to a point where these coding agents are going to be, peers with one another in terms of just raw performance, whatever benchmark for coding they're being evaluated on. And you indicated that UX, the user experience, is going to be a differentiator. I also think accessibility to the agent itself, or the ease to get started, is going to be a differentiator. Accessibility, I mean, the most obvious one, of course, comes down to price. If there was a free one that is going to be as good or almost as good as a paid one, that's immediately going to skew an entire user base of small business owners, professionals who might have, a side hustle, a side gig, their own project. They're going to go towards a free one. And so, with that train of thought, it would be hard for me not to mention Google in this, not only because Gemini, alongside Claude, which is Anthropic's LLM, and ChatGPT, which is OpenAI's, is, those are the 3 often put in conversation with each other, like when people are evaluating them. But I have been using Google Colab for ever since it was introduced to me, maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And the reason why I used Google Colab was because I had Gmail, and the organization I was working in had Google Workspace, which meant there was no barrier to entry. I had to just go in my Google Drive and open a new Colab notebook. And for, the audience members who've never used it, Colab basically sets everything up for you such that when you open your new file, you get a text box or a text window, and you can type your code into it right away and click the play button, and it will run that code for you.
Yep.
And so it'd be really hard for me to not imagine a future where Google doesn't leverage their LLM capabilities now to fold it in to what is already a workflow that many people were using for very basic tasks. Like I was using Google Colab if, I wanted a very quick run through like the data, like show me how many duplicates are in this data set. And it's like ready for me to do.
I think you're right. Like Google's like this like odd sleeping giant. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
odd.
it's an odd thing because like I use Colab too, and I used before that Jupyter notebooks, hosted myself.
Okay.
But it's like, I'm always scared that Google's going to be like, I read a headline that they're like, hey, we just laid off all the people in the notebook area. You're just like, okay, like, so they give me pause a different reason, but you're totally right. Accessibility, GitHub won the early open source audience because they offered it in the cloud for free at the very beginning. And it just got everyone there and everyone was like, fine. So I think that accessibility, like super convenience wins the day. Hey, it's super convenient. It's literally free. You put all your code there. Then 10 years later, 20 years later, it's like, hey, we're training on your code. Hey, that's not cool. But, I think maybe we have to wrap up this podcast, but for like humankind, just like in humankind, kind of like big picture, using your words to describe something very sophisticated and it automatically comes out as a working program, I think that's overall great for all of us. I think that is a really aspirational thing. And I think that the gradient between now and then getting to that point is going to be probably a lot longer than we think. But I think that it's going to actually, as of today, Copilot's there, Workspace is coming, all these other competitors are coming. It's going to actually change everybody the way we work. And it's going to give us superpowers for some, and it's going to give us like brand new powers for others. I think it's powerful. I overall, I think it's powerful. I might not even be around. It might take 35, 40 years or 50 years to get there, but it's coming because the way capitalism works is it's like, it is a billion-person market. Like they're like, Microsoft wants to go find 1 billion people to sell them software. It's going to happen. I think it's overall going to be a good thing. I think, but the messy middle is going to be brutal for people that make their professions making code for a living. It's not going to be like, this is all great news for me. It's going to be challenging in some cases. I would say hang in there. There's going to be all kinds of cool stuff that you're going to like, but for people that are brand new, this is going to be great for them. I don't know what you guys think.
Well, I think, to go back to Francesca's question of what the differentiator is, I mean, those are my exact responses, the things that you listed out. Who can integrate these tools into workflows where people already are? And I think that's one of the main things that gives Microsoft an advantage. I think you're totally right with Google. They have a huge advantage. I mean, we've talked about this at length on other podcasts. They have a huge built-in audience already. And I wouldn't count Apple out either, even though they're very much absent from a lot of these conversations. If one company really has mastered, the user experience in most ways, I think it's definitely them.
Yeah, but their IDs or Xcode IDs.
They have, but when I'm thinking of super convenience, I think of the fact that so many of us have these phones, and if you think about where natural language commands and instructions are going, I think it's not just the written word. It's very much what they say.
I think that's a really good point.
It's very much what they say, and there's this small cottage industry of AI hardware devices that are coming out. From what I've seen, it's been very underwhelming. But Apple is looking very hard at this space, and Siri is notoriously bad, but they know that. Right? And it's why they're having conversations with the OpenAIs and the Googles of the world. Something very big is happening because it's not just the written word; it's what people say, and I think that's going to become a big part of people's daily lives.
I was going to say Siri might be bad, but she's been listening for about a decade, so we have no idea what she's going to come up with.
Same with Alexa.
Francesca, let's throw it over.
My Google Home hasn't spoken up during this podcast. But
we'll throw it over to you, Francesca, because I know we got to wrap it up. But go ahead.
I would say so in addition to both of your wrapping thoughts, I would say that and this is true, at least the way I look at Gen AI as a whole, it's really exciting and it's really easy to see the big picture immediately, to kind of go from 0 to 1, as you said, with, without like really thinking about the intermediary, like 0.1 steps. And it's maybe easiest to do that with Copilot, where you're really thinking like, I definitely grew up in an era of the kind of garage startup kind of, romanticized story of like, you at a computer with your coding genius can come up with the next unicorn, the next $1 billion company. And I think when you encounter things like Copilot for the first time, it's like really easy to romanticize that me and my computer, but now with only 2 lines of instruction rather than thousands of lines of code or hundreds of thousands of lines of code, can come up with that next thing. And so it's really easy to do that with just Gen AI in general. Like maybe with ChatGPT, I can write the next like Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? Or the next Hobbit or something like that. But I think my main takeaway from this conversation and what I'd like to sort of leave with the audience members is think about just the next like 0.1 step. And for me, the next 0.1 step with something like Copilot or any of the coding assistants like Codium or Amazon Q is that there are already many tasks that require coding ability, like creating visualizations from raw data, like translating raw data into some meaningful takeaways, even something like, getting a simple web page started. Like these are all 0.1 steps to get to that $1 billion company. Like, every company has a website, every company you'll think has like some kind of record management system, maybe sales workflow, but these are all just 0.1 steps that you can get started with right now. And so if you are just getting started with some coding assistant for the first time, maybe the point of entry is feeding some kind of data driven task. And hey, I need a bar chart that tells me, the months that my rental property gives me the most revenue. And that 0.1 step is, going to be as meaningful for you today as the like 1 step in a decade to some kind of fully fledged software product out of Copilot or any coding assistant. So
I would say from the perspective of someone who was not classically trained in software development and had to go through just a lot of self-learning over the years, the process of learning these tools oftentimes, it's very I think necessarily focused on very specific areas, which makes it hard for beginners to really see how the broader system is interconnected. It's like, okay, I understand the logic of the code, but how do I get it to show up on a web page, right? Like there's just a lot of like typing that you need to become familiar with, and that's not an easy process to go through. And so I'm speaking to the developers of these coding tools, and I'm thinking, how do you go from the developer class into reaching a much broader audience? Like you really have to think from the beginner's perspective, and help them put those different components of the ecosystem together, or hide them all together, where it's just like, it's not tailored to a developer. It's tailored to someone who knows nothing. And that UI is very different, right? So if you're building an IDE or an editor for someone who's never coded before, it's probably going to look and feel so much different than what you see today.
Yeah, it will. It will. And I think it's going to be exciting and powerful. So let's wrap it up. I'll say thanks, Francesca, Shane.
Thank you.
It was great. We'll be back very shortly with another one. We could probably bring this back up or talk about something brand new, but it was a good discussion. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.